Circles family. This is Allison Sandlin Liles coming to you from our home. Like the rest of you, we are home during this time of physical isolation. This class initially was supposed to be in person, and it would have been a much better in person class because I envisioned it to be one of dialogue and conversation, but sadly, that is not possible right now. So, this is a class for parents program, and I was asked to talk about kids and when they ask us difficult questions. Not if, because we all know the questions are coming, but when. And the reason that I was asked to be a part of your program this spring is because I was a contributing author to a book that came out in the fall from Chalice Press featuring a lot of different faith leaders of all different, mostly Christian, but some interfaith authors as well, called When Kids Ask the Hard Questions. And it's available on Amazon and on Chalice Press. And I definitely encourage you to buy this. I worked for Episcopal Peace Fellowship for 6 years, and in the first few months of that job, the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School happened. And at that point, our son Hill was 3.5, and our daughter Paylett was 1. And we knew that even though Hill was only 3, that it was probably going to affect him more than Eric and me. And so we decided right then to have a conversation with what happened at that school in Connecticut. And it was hard and it was awkward. And he could only sit and listen to conversations about gun violence for just a few minutes at a time because he was 3. Sadly, we've had a lot of opportunities to talk about school shootings over the past 8 years. And so I feel like we've sort of figured out how to have those conversations and how to provide our kids with the resources and the support that they need to be able to receive the information that we're sharing with them. And so my chapter is about talking to kids about school violence. And there are chapters in this book that cover so many different topics, from body image to kids who they might be in school with, who have developmental differences from them, how to talk to your kids about getting a divorce or about gender identity, racial reconciliation, why it's important to talk to the Black kids at your class, or answer the question, why are all the Black and brown kids sitting by themselves in the cafeteria? There's a lot of great resources in this book. And one of the best things about it is that it allows you as parents to be proactive in how you talk to your kids. We know that these difficult questions are coming, and so this allows us to do a little bit of research and get our feet underneath us. So when the questions do happen, we have at least a little bit of an idea of how we are going to address them. So buy the book, and then you're going to be a little bit more prepared. But what I think we can do now is talk about how to lay a foundation so that your kids feel comfortable asking you these hard questions. Because the truth is that if we aren't listening to our kids when they're younger, they're not going to think that we're going to listen to them when they're older and they've got more important things to ask and to share with us about their day. Something really helpful that I heard on a parenting podcast many, many years ago when our kids were in preschool is there was a dad of teenagers being interviewed. And one of the parents of preschoolers, who was the host of the show, asked this dad of teenagers how he was able to raise kids who felt comfortable calling him from a party in which there was a lot of drinking and they weren't supposed to be at the party, but the teenager felt comfortable enough to call the dad and ask him to come pick him up. And I know that I never felt like that in high school. I didn't feel like calling and asking my parents for help was going to end in anything other than being grounded for the foreseeable future. And so I was really interested in his answer. And what he said was, I spent a lot of time when my kids were younger listening to them talk about things that were interesting to them. And at that point, our son Hill was so obsessed with Pokemon cards. He had no idea how to play, but he had about 500 cards and knew everything about every one of them. And literally, all he wanted to do was flip through his binder of cards and read us all of the names, the types, what they evolved into, and any special powers that they had. It was the most mind-numbing thing. Like, I felt like my brain was bleeding listening to him talk about Pokemon cards. And so a lot of times I listened for like 30 seconds and then I found something else to do, or I pulled out my phone or a book and I totally tuned him out. So hearing that man on the podcast talk about investing time when kids were younger so that kids knew that the dad or mom or whoever the caregiver is was truly interested in what they had to say, and how much it paid off later was completely eye-opening to me. Now, I still really struggle with this. Our son really, really likes to talk to us about every single thing he's interested in. And so when he goes on and on and on about Calvin and Hobbes strips that he's read and memorized and wants to replay them verbally, or tell us about a new video game that he's playing, we tend to give him a 10-minute timer and say that we will listen as much as we can for 10 minutes. And then after that, we have to change the subject. And I'm hoping that that will help us when he's a little bit older. We're lucky with him because he was the kid who would get into the car after school and give us the complete rundown of all the times he had gotten in trouble, all the things that he learned. He's getting a little bit quieter now, but he was happy to share. Our other daughter is like a lot of kids and does not share things as easily. And so we have to work harder to hear about how her day went. And so one of the things that we realized when they were younger is that we needed to create a space for them to be able to share with us. Because while some kids do get into the car and immediately dump everything that they learned that day and everything they're feeling, and they want to process it verbally right then and there, not everybody's like that. And so at dinner, we decided to create a space every night at dinner while we were eating to answer the same 4 questions every single night. How were you kind today? How did you fail today? How did you succeed today? And we ended up adding a 4th question, which was there a time today in which you didn't feel safe? Because that way, most of the time, they're always saying, no, we always felt safe. But enough times they started to tell us about feeling unsafe around a particular kid at school or an adult who made them feel funny, that we realized it was really important to keep that question in there. So that was a way for us to just have a conversation and know that there was going to be an opportunity to share every night. And sometimes the kids weren't into it, sometimes we weren't into it, but we always knew that those questions were coming. And so it was really helpful to keep them in mind all throughout the day as we moved through work and school, and to think about how we were going to show kindness, because we were going to need to share it that night at dinner. And also knowing that when we failed, it was okay, because that night at dinner, we were going to hear from the rest of our family about ways that they failed as well. So creating space. Now that our schedules are a little bit different, the family dinner doesn't always happen, and so we have to find time for other opportunities to talk. We are huge fans of car ride conversations, particularly when it's just one kid and one adult, because the adult is focused on the road and is not really making a lot of eye contact, and the kid is free to look out the window or look down at their hands and can ask questions that are uncomfortable and are hard to ask when you're face to face. And I think this is the same if you're taking a walk or if you're running together or going on a hike, where you don't have to look at each other. So some of the things that have come up for us in the car ride, we had a 5-year-old once hold up his middle finger and ask us, does this mean you hate God? He had learned that in kindergarten. So we had a whole conversation about what the middle finger means and why we don't use it. And that it doesn't really have anything to do with God, but God doesn't really like it when you use it. We had, after my son's most recent checkup, 11, his well visit at the pediatrician, I did not know that that was an opportunity for the HPV vaccine to be given, and we had not talked about it as a family. And so we opted out of it so we could have a conversation together and then revisit it next year. And so Hill was looking at the HPV paperwork in the back of the car, reading it because that's what he does. He reads. And as we were driving, he asked what it was. And then he asked what some of the words were because he had no idea. And so we had a whole conversation about STDs and what they are, which led to condoms. Because even though they're having some health conversations at school, that hasn't happened. We've talked about sex many, many, many times in our house, but somehow condoms either didn't come up or have not stuck. So we had this conversation really for about 25 minutes as we were stuck in traffic coming home from the pediatrician, talking about some really important stuff. And he felt free to ask us a lot of questions. And it was good. And then we got out of the car and he, gave me a hug and then he went on to go play with some Legos. So creating space is really, really important, and making time to listen to your kids when they're younger is really important. They're not going to just magically start talking to you if you haven't taken the time, invested the time in listening to them. Starting when they're younger, but even if your kids are a little older, trying to listen to them now as much as you can. Those are really important. Another thing is to remember that most of these difficult questions are not answered with one conversation, that they are ongoing conversations. And especially when kids are little, they can't sit still, they can't remember, and they can only take in whatever they can handle. And I often see this as a priest at funerals. Whenever we see little kids who are attending funerals for family members, it is not uncommon to see everybody else there sad and then to see a 4-year-old skipping down the aisle because they've been grieving as much as they can, and then their little 4-year-old heart can't grieve anymore, and so they're acting like a kid again. And this is exactly what will happen in some of these conversations. So if your child comes to you and wants to know what sex is, that was a question we were asked by a kid in our house when they were 4.5 or 5, knowing that they have no idea. It's a word that they didn't know, and our rule at home was that you don't use any words unless you know what they mean, and if you don't know what they mean, ask us, because even if they're a bad word, it's okay to say it so you can find out what it means. And so we had the question, what is sex? And I asked always, why are you asking? And what do you think it means? Because it's important that when we're answering a question that we answer their question, not what we think that they're asking. We don't need to give them more than what they actually need or want at the time. So at that point, there was absolutely no underlying reason except for I heard this word and didn't know what it meant. And so we talked about the difference between male and female as being different sexes and gender. And then we revisited that question again a couple years later. So knowing what is being asked is really important. And then answering just that. And knowing that with the right language, anything can be covered. So last summer, we realized that some of our kids' friends were starting to get cell phones, and so we wanted to go ahead and start talking to them about pornography, which is something that I feel like we didn't really have to have that conversation with. My parents didn't even think about that when we were younger. And so we borrowed a book from neighbors up the street called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, and it was really helpful, except for when our family went to an art museum and our daughter wouldn't look at any of the pictures because she said they were all bad paintings because there were breast everywhere. So that there was a downside to this book. But the idea is that the kids are going to see things on their friends' phones or tablets that are not great pictures for little kids to see. And so they need to know what to look for and then when to tell a grown up. Ironically, the same family that loaned us this book, just a few days ago, I was catching up with the mom who I haven't seen in 3 weeks. We were out walking dogs, and she was on one side of the street, and I was on the other. And I was just asking how things was going and how parenting with kids with pretty big age differences was going in their house. And she had mentioned that having schoolwork on the iPad was actually the hardest thing because they just don't tend to use the iPad very often. And so, since he's the older kids using it a lot, they've been letting their preschooler use the family iPad. And when she opened it up, a big pornography image came right up on the web browser. And the son had tried to close it out, but just kind of closed it but didn't clear it. And so she found it and realized that he's dyslexic. And so when he went to type in a perfectly safe website, he misplaced a couple letters and then came to a website promoting how good pornography is. But she had already had that conversation with him. And so they talked a little bit more about what he saw. And it just reminded me that those underlying conversations are so important to have with kids, so that they always know that you are available to talk to them and that they're not in trouble, because we want to have a clear and open conversation. And so I think that's about all that I think that I have to offer in terms of having these hard questions asked of you. Don't freak out. Know that they're coming. When kids are really little, the questions are all the why questions from when they're toddlers, and they're incessant and funny, but they can be annoying. And then when they get a little bit older and their understanding of the world and relationships change, their questions begin to change. And I hope that you will have patience to listen to those questions and to answer them. I know that I pray for patience all the time to keep listening to stories about Minecraft and still Pokemon. It's been 6 years and we are still hearing about Pokemon in our house. And being able to listen to those things, because if they're important to your kids, then it's important to at least let them hear you, or let them see you hearing them. And so that will be set up. You're setting them up for a great relationship moving forward. So find a time when you can check in honestly, and not just asking questions of your kids, but have them ask questions of you. We have a wonderful set of questions that we keep in a question jar. We call it the miraculous question jar that we keep on our kitchen table for any time conversations are starting to drag at dinner, or there's a lot of fighting or whining. And one color question means the parents ask the kids. Another color question means that everybody asks each other. And then the favorite is the color that indicates the kids get to ask the parent questions. And they really love hearing stories from our childhood, because they're always surprised that we actually went through a lot of the same things that they're going through, even though their childhood is so much more complicated, I feel like, than what ours was. So finding ways to talk and to be silly and to have fun and to love each other and to bless one another, and to forgive each other. These are all the things that help lay a foundation for being able to ask and to answer difficult questions. May God be with you through all of these parenting endeavors. Bye.